Rain fell over Manhattan in silver threads, blurring the city lights into watercolor swirls. From the 40th floor of Wilson Innovations. The skyline looked like a painting, but Margaret Brown wasn't here to admire it. She was still on the ground floor, breathless, her sneakers squeaking against polished marble as she rushed through the lobby. Her laptop bag tugged at her shoulder, a thick folder of research clutched to her chest. This was the day. The neural implant project, her project, was finally being pitched to Wilson Innovations. She knew the stakes as the youngest neuroscientist at Apex Medical Solutions and one of the few black women in her field. Every word she spoke, every graph she showed, would be scrutinized twice as hard. Failure wasn't an option. She turned a corner too fast. "Watch out," a voice warned, but it was too late. The collision was sharp, scattering papers into the air like startled birds. Margaret stumbled back, heat rushing to her cheeks. "Oh my God, I'm so sorry," she blurted, dropping to her knees to collect the documents. "It's all right." The voice was low and steady, calm, in the way of someone who rarely, if ever, felt flustered. She glanced up and the world seemed to slow. Tall, broad-shouldered, a perfectly tailored navy suit, dark brown hair swept neatly back, and piercing blue eyes that watched her with an unreadable glint. She didn't need an introduction to know who he was. Brian Wilson. The Brian Wilson, CEO of Wilson Innovations, one of the most powerful men in the country. Her breath caught for a moment, but she forced her voice into something resembling professionalism. "Mr. Wilson, I didn't mean to call me Brian." He handed her the neatly stacked papers he'd helped gather. "You're Margaret Brown from Apex Medical Solutions. You're here for the neural implant presentation." She blinked. "Yes, I am." "I didn't realize you'd—" He said I wasn't planning to attend. Tilting his head slightly, studying her, not with judgment, but with an almost quiet curiosity. "But I like to keep an eye on research that has the potential to save lives, especially when it involves stroke recovery." His gaze softened for the briefest second. "My father had one a few years back." Margaret hesitated, the air between them suddenly heavier. "I'm sorry to hear that." Brian glanced at his watch. "I may need to change my schedule today. Come on, private elevators are this way." Before she could process it, they were walking side by side, his stride steady, hers slightly hurried to keep up. The city's noise disappeared inside the elevator, replaced by a charged silence. She could feel the weight of his presence, not intimidating exactly, but commanding, like he occupied more space than just the physical. "What are you thinking about?" His voice broke the quiet. "That people are probably looking at me like I just won the lottery," she said before she could stop herself. He chuckled low and warm. "They always look. It's the price of being known." The elevator doors opened to a glass-walled conference room above the rain-slick streets. Her supervisor's eyes widened at the sight of Brian entering with her. As the meeting began, Margaret pushed aside the surreal nature of it all and focused on what mattered. Charts, data, stories of patients. She explained how the implant stimulated neural pathways and how 70% of trial subjects regained significant motor function within 3 months. The room quieted, not with boredom, but attention. She saw Brian listening, not just politely, but fully. His gaze locked, absorbing every detail. When it ended, Apex had secured funding for extended trials. It was the breakthrough she'd been working toward for years. But as she packed her notes, Brian's voice stopped her. "Margaret, you were remarkable today." His tone was calm, but there was something in it that lingered. "I want to talk more. Are you free Friday night?" "Just business, of course." Her pulse quickened, though she kept her tone neutral. "Yes, Friday works. I'll send a car." As she entered the rain later, her phone buzzed a message from her best friend. Girl, how did it go? Margaret typed back. You won't believe this. She didn't know it yet, but that one collision in the lobby would alter everything, her career, heart, and life's direction. And if you want to see exactly how a simple business dinner could turn into something neither of them expected, make sure you like this video, share your thoughts in the comments, and follow the channel so you don't miss what happens next. Because trust me, you'll want to know where this story goes. Friday evening draped itself over Manhattan like a sheet of silk. The rain from earlier in the week replaced by a crisp, cool air that carried the scent of autumn. From her small apartment in Harlem, Margaret Brown stood before her mirror, adjusting the simple black dress she had chosen, a piece that had hung in her closet for years, reserved for moments that mattered. It was understated, but it fit her well, hugging her frame without pretension. Her phone vibrated. A text from her best friend, Aisha. You look like a queen. Now breathe and remember, you're the one in control here. Margaret smiled, though a knot of nerves still coiled in her stomach. A black woman from Harlem, stepping into the private world of Brian Wilson, a white billionaire with a reputation for brilliance and impenetrable walls. It felt like walking across a glass bridge over a canyon. A sleek black sedan pulled up outside. The driver, dressed in a neat uniform, greeted her with a courteous nod. Miss Brown, Mr. Wilson is expecting you. She slipped inside the leather seats, cool beneath her hands. The city lights slid past the windows in streaks of gold and silver, each block carrying her further from the familiar rhythm of her neighborhood and deeper into a world she wasn't sure would ever feel like hers. Aurora sat high above the city, its glass walls revealing a skyline so close it felt touchable. Inside, golden lights spilled across crisp white linens, and the air carried a faint note of champagne and roasted herbs. Diners paused mid-conversation as Margaret walked past, their eyes lingering just long enough for her to feel the weight of it. Brian rose from the corner of a private dining room as she entered. He wasn't wearing the armor of his usual suit. Tonight, it was a tailored charcoal jacket with an open collar, the fabric catching the warm light. His blue eyes found hers instantly. Margaret, he said, pulling out her chair. Thank you for coming. She settled into the seat, placing the folder of research notes she had brought on the table, a shield she wasn't quite ready to let go of. Thank you for inviting me, she replied, her tone measured. He glanced at the folder, then back at her. Always prepared. Let's set work aside for a moment. The waiter arrived with 2 flutes of champagne. Brian lifted his glass to new beginnings. Margaret's lips curved to help patients regain what they've lost. The first sip was light and crisp, but her pulse was anything but calm. First time here? He asked. She nodded. Aurora's a little out of my league. I usually eat at Mr. Jackson's sandwich shop down the block from my apartment. Brian leaned forward, genuinely intrigued. Tell me about Harlem. She hesitated, then began. She spoke of her father, a history teacher, and her mother, a librarian, of streets alive with laughter and the quiet lessons her parents had taught her, that education was the path forward, and that self-worth was something no one could take unless you handed it over. It wasn't always easy, she admitted. As a black girl in science, I had to work twice as hard to be seen half as much. His expression softened. Your parents must be proud. They are, she said, then added with a small smile. Though my mother keeps telling me not to let the lab consume me. She wants me to find joy outside of work. Brian's gaze drifted briefly, as if her words had touched something he rarely shared. I know that feeling, he said quietly. When my father died of a stroke, I buried myself in work, built Wilson Innovations into everything I could imagine. But sometimes I wonder what I lost in the process. Margaret tilted her head. Do you ever feel lonely? The question escaped before she could take it back. His eyes met hers, unflinching almost every day. Something unspoken passed between them. Then two people who understood the quiet ache of being unseen, despite living in entirely different worlds. Dinner arrived: grilled salmon for her, a perfectly seared steak for him. They spoke of her dream to one day open a community lab in Harlem, where children could discover the wonder of science without barriers. He listened with an attentiveness that made her feel her words mattered. "That's remarkable," he said at last. "Not many people think of giving back like that." By the time they finished dessert, the room felt warmer, the air between them threaded with something delicate, but undeniable. Outside, rain had begun again, tracing silver paths down the glass. When they entered his car, the city seemed quieter, more intimate. As they reached her building, she turned to him. "Thank you for tonight. I enjoyed it." His gaze lingered. "So did I. Will I see you again?" Her heartbeat quickened. Maybe. And not just for work. When she stepped into her apartment, she was still carrying the scent of roasted herbs and champagne, the echo of his voice, and the awareness that something had shifted tonight. Something neither of them could quite name, but both had felt. The following Thursday evening, Harlem's streets were still slick from an afternoon shower, neon reflections shimmering in the puddles. Margaret Brown walked beside Brian Wilson toward the Blue Note Jazz Club, the faint hum of a saxophone spilling out into the night air. Tonight wasn't about presentations or project updates. It wasn't even planned. Brian had called earlier, his voice lighter than usual. "I have 2 tickets to Blue Note. You might like a change of pace." Inside, the air was warm with the scent of aged wood and old records, the low murmur of conversations weaving around the slow heartbeat of the bass. They slipped into a small table near the stage. Margaret let herself sink into the music, each note peeling away the tension she carried from the lab. She watched Brian from the corner of her eye, noting how he seemed almost different here. No suit jacket, no boardroom posture, just a man quietly tapping his fingers in time with the rhythm. Between sets, they talked in the easy way that came when no one was measuring their words. She told him about her grandmother, the woman whose stroke had inspired her career, and how she still remembered the stubborn light in her eyes, despite her physical struggles. Brian shared how he'd once snuck into a jazz bar during college to impress a girl, only to be caught by the bouncer before the first song was over. Margaret laughed, really laughed, and the sound seemed to pull something out of him, something unguarded. When the last note faded and the applause washed over the room, they stepped outside into the cool night. But the moment they turned the corner, it shattered. A burst of white light blinded her, camera flashes exploding in rapid fire. A man crouched by a lamppost shouted, "Brian Wilson." "Who's the woman?" Instinctively, she turned her face away, her heart lurching. Brian's arm came around her shoulders, steadying her as he guided her toward the waiting car. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his voice low but firm. "I should have warned you." Back in her apartment, Margaret sank into the couch, still feeling the afterimage of the flashes in her eyes. She reached for her phone, and as she feared, the photos were already online. Wilson's mystery companion. One headline read, "Another was less delicate: billionaire's new flame, unknown scientist, spotted at jazz club." She clicked away before the words could sink deeper. She wasn't unknown. She wasn't someone's accessory. She was a neuroscientist whose work might help stroke patients walk again. But in the world of glossy headlines, none of that seemed to matter. Her phone buzzed. "Aisha. Girl, you're famous. Don't worry. These tabloids move on fast." Margaret tried to smile at the message, but the weight in her chest didn't lift. She knew with a kind of bone-deep certainty that for a black woman in her position, public scrutiny wasn't fleeting. It could be relentless, even cruel. The next morning at Apex Medical Solutions, the shift was palpable. Conversations dipped when she walked into the lab. Mark, one of her colleagues, grinned in a way that didn't reach his eyes. "Famous now, huh? I saw you online last night." She gave a polite, tight smile and moved on, focusing on the neural implant trial data on her screen. After implementing the polymer insulation layer, the latest tests showed improved signal stability, but refinement was still needed. She muttered to herself about latency reductions, trying to drown out the low hum of gossip in the background. That afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message from Brian. "There's a charity gala next week. I want you there for the project, not just because I want people to see the incredible woman I'm getting to know." Margaret stared at the words. The gala would be crawling with the city's most influential and most judgmental people. It was an opportunity for the project and a stage for more speculation. She typed her reply carefully. "I'll go, but I want to be introduced as a researcher, not just your guest." His answer came quickly. "Of course. I'm proud of you, Margaret." She set the phone down and looked out the window at the late afternoon light spilling across the street. Pride and fear sat side by side in her chest. The gala might open doors, or it might build walls she'd spend years tearing down. For now, she turned back to her work. The science at least was something she could control. Everything else felt like a storm gathering at the edges of her life, and she could already hear the distant roll of thunder. The Grand Meridian Hotel glimmered like a palace in the heart of Manhattan. Its towering glass facade reflected the city's lights, and inside a ballroom, stretched beneath vaulted ceilings, chandeliers scattering light like shards of crystal. Margaret Brown stood at the entrance, the weight of 100 curious eyes pressing against her skin, before she even stepped inside. Her deep blue gown was the most elegant thing she owned, though it hadn't been hers for long. A neatly wrapped box had arrived at her apartment the day before, with a note from Brian for the gala. "Thought you might like something that feels like the night sky." The fabric hugged her figure, the color making her warm brown skin glow under the lobby lights. Still, she smoothed her palms down the skirt to quiet her nerves. Then he was there. Brian in a black tuxedo, the sharp lines of his suit softened by the warmth in his eyes when they met hers. "You look..." His voice trailed off, but the faint smile that touched his lips finished the sentence for him. He offered his arm. "Ready as I'll ever be," she murmured. They stepped into the ballroom together, and the hum of conversation shifted almost imperceptibly. Some heads turned in polite acknowledgement. Others lingered longer gaze, sharpening with curiosity or judgment. Margaret kept her chin high, her mother's voice echoing, "Don't let anyone make you feel small." Midway through the evening, Brian took the stage to speak. He thanked donors, spoke about Wilson Innovation's latest projects, and then without hesitation introduced her. Margaret Brown, he said, his voice carrying through the room, is the brilliant mind behind the neural implant technology that is changing the lives of stroke patients. Her work has brought us closer to restoring mobility and independence for countless people. Applause filled the ballroom. Margaret felt her heart pound, not from stage fright, but from the sudden wave of being seen. Not as a headline, not as the woman on Brian Wilson's arm, but as a scientist. After the speech, Brian guided her toward a group of investors. She precisely answered their questions, outlining trial results and the next steps for clinical testing. Most listened with interest. One did not. An older man with silver hair and a champagne flute tilted his head at her. "Ms. Brown," he began, voice smooth but edged. "How does someone so young manage to get the attention of Brian Wilson and the funding for such an ambitious project?" Margaret caught the insinuation immediately. She met his gaze without flinching. "I developed a technology that helps stroke patients walk again. That's what got his attention, sir." A beat of silence, then a few polite smiles. Brian's expression didn't shift, but she felt his quiet pride beside her like a steadying hand. Later they danced under the golden light of the chandeliers. The orchestra's melody wrapped around them, but Margaret's thoughts drifted to the stares, the whispers she'd overheard. She leaned in slightly. "Everyone's watching us." Brian's hand tightened at her waist. "Let them. You're the only one I see." The warmth in his voice should have been enough to dissolve the tension in her chest, but it lingered. Because she knew the truth in his world eyes didn't just watch, they judged, recorded, and speculated. And those whispers had a way of echoing far longer than a single evening. As the night drew close, they left the ballroom through a side exit, avoiding the photographers at the front. In the car, the city slid past in streaks of gold and shadow. "You were perfect tonight," Brian said quietly. Margaret turned her gaze to the window. "I hope they remember my words more than my dress." "They will," he said, his voice certain. But she couldn't shake the feeling that something else had been planted in the spaces between applause and conversation, something she might have to fight to uproot. The air in Harlem carried the faint scent of frying chicken and autumn leaves, a combination Margaret Brown had known her whole life. On this Saturday evening, the streets seemed to hum with the easy rhythm of her neighborhood children darting past with laughter, an older man whistling on his stoop, a gospel choir practicing faintly somewhere in the distance. She stood in front of the townhouse she'd grown up in, hands tucked into her coat pockets. Beside her, Brian Wilson looked both out of place and entirely present. He wore a simple blue button-down and dark jeans, the crispness of the fabric hinting at its expense. But there was no air of arrogance in him, only attentiveness. "You ready for this?" she asked, half teasing, half earnest. He smiled faintly. "I want to meet your family, Margaret." The front door opened before she could reply. "Sweetheart Angela Harris." Her mother greeted her with a warmth that could outshine the setting sun. Margaret stepped into her mother's arms, the familiar embrace grounding her. "And you must be Brian." Angela continued, turning to him with a polite but assessing gaze. "Welcome to our home." Inside, the narrow hallway opened into a cozy living room, its walls lined with framed photos, Margaret in her graduation gown, her parents at their wedding, snapshots of birthdays and church picnics. The air was thick with the scent of cornbread and sweet potatoes. From the kitchen, James Harris emerged, carrying a tray of biscuits. He said, "You're just in time," his deep voice carrying warmth and quiet authority. "Come on in before the food gets cold." Around the dining table, relatives and neighbors laughed and traded stories. Cousin Tiana was there, quick with her sharp wit, and Uncle Roy always seemed to have a tale about Harlem in the 70s ready to go. Brian sat among them, listening intently, asking questions, never once making the conversation about himself. Angela, though smiling, kept an observant eye on him. At one point, she leaned back in her chair and asked, "So, Brian, what keeps you so busy these days?" He met her gaze evenly. "I run Wilson Innovations, but lately the most essential part of my work has been supporting Margaret's neural implant project. She's doing something extraordinary, changing lives." Angela's expression softened just a fraction. "I've heard all about it. She works herself to the bone, that one." She gave her daughter a look, equal parts pride and concern. "Just don't forget to live, Margaret." Dinner was a warm, noisy affair, punctuated by laughter and the clinking of cutlery. Yet Margaret could feel the subtle undercurrent of curiosity in the room. How naturally Brian fit into the conversation, how he laughed at Uncle Roy's jokes, and how he treated her parents with a genuine, not-performed respect. After dessert, she led him to the small park down the street, where the street lamps softened the night's edges. They stopped near an old swing set, its chains worn but sturdy. "I used to sit here," Margaret said, her voice low, "and imagine becoming a scientist. But I was afraid, too afraid, The world wouldn't accept a black girl from Harlem. She hesitated before adding, "Bringing you here. I worried you wouldn't belong." Brian took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "I don't need to belong everywhere," he said quietly. "I need to belong where you are." Her breath caught. In the street lamp's glow, his words felt heavier than the cool night air. She searched his face, looking for the catch, the line where sincerity might falter, but found none. As they returned, Angela was waiting by the door with a small box. "Cookies," she said, pressing them into Brian's hands. "Don't let her skip meals when she's working." He smiled. "I'll try Mrs. Harris." On the ride back to her apartment, Margaret sat in comfortable silence. She thought about how easily he'd folded himself into the rhythm of her world tonight, and how much she wanted to believe he could stay there. But beneath that warmth, a small thread of worry still pulled at her. Because fitting in with her family was one thing. Fitting into her life with all its pressures and expectations was something else entirely. Rain slicked the glass walls of Brian Wilson's office, and the city beyond them was reduced to blurred constellations of light. Margaret stood in the doorway, still damp from the short walk across the plaza, her coat clinging to her shoulders. She had come because his message had been brief, but weighted. "Can you meet me at 6? It's important." Brian rose from behind his desk as she entered, his blue eyes sharp with something she couldn't quite name. Determination, maybe, but there was worry there too. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. "I've been thinking about what you've been going through. The questions, the whispers, Carter's comment." She shook her head slightly. "Brian, we talked about this. I need to handle it on my own. This isn't interference," he said, his voice steady but low. "It's a solution." He came around to stand beside her chair, resting one hand on the edge of his desk. "I've proposed that the neural implant project be spun into its own independent entity. It'll be managed by a scientific board led by Apex, and you'll remain head researcher. But you won't report to me and Wilson. Innovations will step back from direct oversight." Margaret stared at him, her heartbeat picking up. "You're giving up control of one of your company's most important projects?" "Yes." His gaze didn't waver. "Because I want you to be recognized for your talent, not questioned because of me." She leaned back, trying to process the enormity of it. "Your board won't like this. They'll think you're risking too much for me." "They can think whatever they want," he replied quietly. "I believe in you. And I believe in what this project can do for people, my father, your grandmother, and every patient waiting." Her throat tightened. "Brian, this is your investment. If it fails, then I take the loss," he said. "I've built this company from the ground up. I know what risks look like. This one is worth it." The following day, he faced the board in a meeting Margaret wasn't invited to attend. She spent the morning in the lab, trying to focus on signal latency data, while her mind drifted to him standing under the scrutiny of the people who had the power to fight him on this. When her phone finally buzzed, the message was short. "It's official." She called him immediately. "Tell me what happened." They pushed back, he said, his voice carrying the faint weariness of battle. "Grayson called it reckless. Carter said I was letting personal feelings cloud my judgment. But I told them this was about science and saving lives. Eventually, I convinced the majority." Margaret was silent for a long moment, feeling the weight of what he'd done. "You didn't have to do that." "I wanted to," he said softly, "because I want us to have a real chance, not poisoned by rumor or doubt." Her chest ached with a mix of gratitude and fear. What if they're right? What if the project fails and they blame you? "Then let them," he answered. "But they won't." That night, she sat at her kitchen table, the rain pattering against the window, staring at the latest data sets. Her mind circled back to him in that boardroom taking the hits for her. She wanted to protect him from the fallout, just as he had wanted to protect her from the whispers. Her eyes drifted to a photo on the bookshelf, her grandmother leaning on a cane, but smiling with an unshakable light in her eyes. Margaret thought of her promise to herself years ago, "I'll find a way to help others walk again." Brian's decision had given her the space to do that, without the shadow of doubt hanging over her. But it had also tied her success to his sacrifice in a way she couldn't ignore. And she knew with a sudden clarity that she would spend the rest of this project fighting not only for her patients, but for the man who had risked part of his empire to make sure her work could stand on its own. The NeuroHope Auditorium was nothing like the familiar lab at Apex. Its walls were lined with polished wood panels, and the air held the faint scent of old books and new ambition. Margaret Brown stood at the lectern, the soft click of her heels echoing on the stage floor. Rows of seats were filled with the scientific board professors, researchers, medical directors, each face sharp with intellect and sometimes skepticism. This was her first presentation as head of the newly independent neural implant project. No Wilson Innovations executives or Brian are in the corner to catch her eye. Just her, the data, and a room full of minds waiting to decide if she belonged here. She steadied her breath and began. Our latest trials have achieved a 90% reduction in implantation pain while maintaining a 78% improvement in motor function recovery over 12 weeks. Using a low-frequency alternating current has minimized tissue irritation and improved patient comfort significantly. Slide after slide, she laid out the numbers, the methodology, and the independent verification from 3 separate labs. She told the story of Mrs. Margaret Simmons, a 62-year-old stroke patient who had walked to her neighborhood store unaided for the first time in 7 years. Her voice didn't waver, even when she felt certain eyes watching her more for who she was than for what she was saying. Halfway through the Q&A, a hand went up. Dr. Larson, tall and thin, with a lined face, leaned forward. "Ms. Brown, the results are impressive. But given your previous connection to Wilson Innovations, how can we be sure these findings are free from corporate influence?" The question was a blade she'd been expecting. She met his gaze, her tone calm but firm. 3 independent research facilities have verified the data. Every trial has been documented according to international clinical standards. I can provide complete access to the raw methodology for review. I welcome scrutiny because the work can stand on its own. A brief pause. Larson's eyes flickered, and he leaned back without another word. The board chair, Dr. Nguyen, rose when the final question was answered. "Ms. Brown, this is groundbreaking work. NeuroHope is proud to have you leading this initiative." Applause rose, filling the auditorium. It wasn't thunderous, but it was real. Margaret let the sound wash over her, not as a balm, but as a reminder that she had stepped into this space and held it. After the session, she walked alone through the crisp autumn air, outside her breath forming soft clouds. Her phone buzzed. "Brian, how did it go?" She smiled to herself. "Margaret." They called it a breakthrough. His reply was instant. "I told you they would. I'm proud of you." That night, they met at a small restaurant on a quiet street. He listened, as she recounted the presentation, his eyes never leaving hers. "This," he said softly, "is what I wanted for you. A room that sees you for who you are and what you've built." Margaret felt the truth of his words and the shadow that came with them. The media wouldn't stop. The whispers might quiet for now, but they would return dressed in new clothes. And still she would have to walk into rooms like that and prove herself over and over again. Yet tonight, she allowed herself the most minor victory, the knowledge that for once the applause had been hers alone. The air smelled of salt and something faintly sweet from the hibiscus blooming along the shore. Margaret Brown walked barefoot across the cool sand, her white linen dress fluttering around her calves. The waves rolled in gentle arcs, silvered by the moonlight, each crest catching a glimmer before dissolving at her feet. Brian Wilson walked beside her, sleeves rolled, hands tucked loosely into his pockets. They had been on the island for 3 days, his idea of an escape after the long months of trials, presentations, and public scrutiny. Here, there were no reporters, no board meetings, only the sea, the stars, and the quiet time they rarely had in New York. She tilted her head toward him, catching how his eyes followed the horizon before drifting back to her. "You look almost relaxed," she teased. He smiled faintly. "That's because I'm exactly where I want to be." They wandered until they reached a flat stretch of rock that jutted into the water. Margaret sat tucking her legs beneath her, watching the foam gather and retreat at the edge. The night felt suspended, as if the rest of the world had stepped back to give them space. Brian lowered himself beside her, his voice quieter now. "Margaret, when you first walked into my life, crashed into it in the lobby, you caught me off guard. I didn't know someone could make me want to slow down and go again." Her heartbeat picked up, though she kept her gaze on the sea. Brian. But he was already reaching into his pocket, pulling out a small velvet box. Her breath caught before he even opened it. Inside, the diamond caught the moonlight, scattering it in 100 directions. "I don't want to imagine my life without you," he said, his tone carrying the weight of something deeply decided. "You've seen me at my best and my worst. You've challenged me and reminded me of what matters. You see me not the CEO, not the headlines, just me. And I see you, Margaret, not the scrutiny, not the whispers, but the woman whose work will change lives. I love you. Will you marry me?" For a moment, all she heard was the rush of the tide. She thought of the first time they'd met, the wary distance she'd kept, the battles she'd fought to stand alone. She thought of the looks at the gala, the questions in the boardroom, the steady pressure of being seen through the lens of someone else's shadow. And yet, sitting here with him, all she felt was the truth, that he had never tried to make her smaller, only to give her room to stand taller. Her eyes stung as she met his gaze. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I'll marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, his hand lingering there, as if he couldn't let go. Then he drew her into his arms, the kiss deep and unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world. Somewhere in her mind, she knew the outside world would make this into something else. A headline, a debate, another round of speculation. But beneath the indifferent stars and the patient moon, there was only the promise between them. She glanced down at the ring when they finally returned to the bungalow. It caught the light again, but it wasn't the stone she saw. It was the man beside her, and the life they were about to step into, come whatever storms might follow. The morning of her wedding, Margaret Brown stood in front of a tall mirror framed in pale wood, the sea breeze slipping through the half-open window of the small bridal room. Sunlight poured in, turning the white of her dress into something almost luminous. The gown was simple, no layers of tulle, no heavy beading, just clean lines that hugged her figure and a soft train that brushed the floor. Her natural curls were pinned loosely, a few strands escaping to frame her face. On the table beside her bouquet, a folded newspaper lay open. The headline stared back at her: "Scientist or social climber, the woman marrying Brian Wilson." The words were printed in bold, each one sharp enough to cut. She told herself not to read further, but her eyes betrayed her. The article questioned her motives, qualifications, and even her work's independence. Her throat tightened, but she forced the paper shut. A knock sounded, and Aisha stepped in wearing a coral dress that made her skin glow. She took one look at Margaret's face and crossed the room. "Don't," she said softly, slipping the paper off the table. "Not today. This day belongs to you, not them." Margaret managed a small smile. "I know. I hate that they'll twist everything." Aisha squeezed her hands. "Then give them something they can't twist, a truth that only you and Brian will carry." Minutes later, the music began. Margaret stepped into the garden, her arm linked with her father's. The air was warm, with the scent of roses and sea salt. Ahead, under an arch of white flowers, Brian stood in a black tuxedo, his gaze locked on hers, as if no one else existed. Her father's grip was steady, as he guided her forward, then placed her hand into Brian's. "Take care of my girl," he said quietly. "I will." Brian answered his voice, carrying a certainty that made Margaret's chest ache. The ceremony unfolded beneath the open sky, waves murmuring in the background. Brian's voice was low but clear when it was time for vows. "Margaret, you've taught me that success means nothing without someone to share it with. You've shown me what it is to see and be seen. I vow to stand beside you in every fight, every triumph, and every quiet moment." Her eyes burned as she spoke in return. "Brian, you've never tried to make me less. You've given me space to be exactly who I am. I vow to walk with you as your equal, to protect the life we build, and to keep believing in the good we can do together." They exchanged rings, their hands trembling just slightly. The applause that followed felt like the ocean wind, soft but all-encompassing. The reception was set under a white canopy, with tables draped in linen and centerpieces of lilies and eucalyptus. There was laughter, clinking glasses, and the warm glow of lanterns as the sun dipped lower. Margaret danced with her mother, who whispered, "You chose well, but remember, your light is your own. Never let anyone dim it." Later, she and Brian slipped away from the crowd to stand by the water. The hem of her dress brushed the sand, and the horizon stretched out in shades of silver and gold. "You all right?" he asked, brushing a stray curl from her cheek. "Yes," she said, meaning it. Today was perfect. Then after a beat, "Even if the world tries to ruin it tomorrow, they can't touch what's real," he replied. She believed him, not because the storms would stop, but because she knew with a quiet certainty that the truth they had built would outlast the noise. The rain returned to the city that evening, delicate and persistent, threading down the floor-to-ceiling windows of the Wilson penthouse. Margaret stood with her hands folded over the gentle curve of her stomach, the skyline shimmering through the glass. The soft hum of the city below felt different now, less a reminder of distance, and more like a heartbeat she shared with it. It had been a year since the wedding, a year of boardroom presentations, late-night lab tests, conferences where her name appeared alongside leading scientists in neurotechnology. Neurohope had grown beyond what she once dared to imagine. Over 200 stroke patients had regained significant mobility, using the implant signal stability, now at 98%. The pain reduction protocol was fully optimized, making the surgery safer and more accessible. She remembered the standing ovation at the International Neurology Conference 2 months ago. Dr. Margaret Brown Wilson, the announcer, had said that her title wrapped around her like a new skin, one she had earned stitch by stitch. Behind her, Brian's footsteps were soft over the polished wood floor. He came to stand beside her, his reflection merging with hers in the glass. "You're staring at the rain again," he murmured, resting his chin lightly on her shoulder. She smiled faintly. "I was remembering the first night I stood here. I told you I didn't think I belonged. And I told you," he said, turning her gently to face him, that you belong here with me." His hand drifted to her stomach, the touch both tender and awed. "And with this little one too." The pregnancy had been confirmed just a week ago. It was early still, but the news had slipped into her life like a quiet blessing, expanding every thought she had about the future. "I keep thinking," she whispered, "our child will have Harlem in their blood, and your world at their fingertips. And maybe the courage to make something entirely their own." "They will," he said. Brian had been working on a new initiative at Wilson Innovations, inspired by her dream of a community lab. The plan is to provide neural implants free of charge to low-income patients, funded through a partnership between NeuroHope and the company. She'd been too moved to speak when he'd first told her. Her parents had flown in the day before to celebrate the news of the baby. Angela's eyes had filled with tears when she hugged her daughter, whispering, "She's going to be a fighter just like her mama." James had clasped Brian's hand with quiet pride. And Aisha had screamed into the phone and immediately started planning a baby shower. Yet even in this season of joy, the old shadows lingered. The press occasionally dredged up the past headlines that referred to her as Mrs. Wilson, without acknowledging her title as doctor. These interviews questioned whether she could separate her work from her marriage. At a recent conference, a former colleague had asked her with a smirk, "Do you ever wonder if you'd be here without Brian?" She had met his gaze evenly. "I'm here because I worked hard, and because patients need me." The man had no reply. Now, with Brian's arms around her and the city lights blinking in the rain, she thought of her grandmother, the woman who had fought through a stroke with a smile that never dimmed. She still carried that strength, and she felt it growing braided with something new. The knowledge that she was building a life for herself and the family they were starting. Brian brushed his lips against her temple. "We've come far," he said quietly. "And we'll go further," she answered. In the reflection of the rain-streaked glass, she saw the life they had built, a partnership forged in resilience, anchored by love, and about to be reshaped by the small, unseen heartbeat she carried within her. Spring rain swept over Harlem in soft sheets that darkened the sidewalks and made the street lamps glow like lanterns in the mist. Margaret Brown Wilson strolled along the block where she'd grown up, one hand resting on the swell of her belly. The air smelled of wet pavement and the faint spice from a bakery she used to visit after school. She paused outside the old library, its brick facade warm with memory. She had spent countless afternoons here as a child, her mother shelving books. At the same time, she sat at the long wooden tables, devouring everything from science magazines to worn copies of historical novels. Her dream had started here, an idea that knowledge could be both a refuge and a key. Now she was living that dream, though the path had never been smooth. NeuroHope was thriving, expanding into clinics across the country. The free implant initiative Brian had championed had already changed dozens of lives. Her name appeared in medical journals alongside groundbreaking data. Still, she knew the real reward was in the quiet moments, watching a patient take their first unaided steps, hearing the laughter of a family reunited with someone they thought they'd lost to a stroke. Brian met her at the corner holding an umbrella, large enough to shelter them both. He slipped his arm around her as they walked toward the townhouse where her parents waited for Sunday dinner. "You're quiet," he said softly. "Just thinking," she replied. "About how far we've come. About the little one. About how I want them to know this street, these people. To understand where they come from." "They will," Brian assured her. "We'll make sure of it." At her parents' table, the evening was filled with the warmth of conversation and the smell of Angela's cornbread baking. James told stories about the history of Harlem to the baby, listening in his voice, a mix of humor and reverence. Even as the rain tapped gently against the windows, The house felt wrapped in light. Later, back in the penthouse, Margaret stood again by the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city blink beneath the thinning clouds. Brian came up behind her, resting his hands on her shoulders. "You've built something incredible," he murmured. "We've built it," she corrected, leaning back into him. "But it's more than the project now. It's a life, one we fought for." The rain slowed to a drizzle, leaving the streets shining and new. In the reflection of the glass, she saw them together. Two people from different worlds who had carved out one of their own steady enough to weather the storms. Margaret turned to him with a smile. "Our child's going to grow up knowing two things: where they come from, and that love, the real kind, doesn't try to change who you are. It makes you more yourself." Brian kissed her forehead, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft hush of rain on the glass. She thought of her grandmother, her parents, the people of Harlem who had shaped her. She thought of the lab patients and every obstacle that had forced her to stand taller. And she thought of the journey still ahead, the challenges, the triumphs, the everyday moments that would weave into the life they were building. If you've followed Margaret and Brian's story from that first unexpected collision in the lobby to this moment, you know this isn't the end. It's the beginning of another chapter. So stay with us. Share what this journey has meant to you in the comments, and follow along for the next steps in their lives. Because the storms will come again, but so will the sunlight.